I think that we're striking the balance.
Yeah.
Right. That is to say, we acknowledge the importance of the strategy and tactics of nonviolence, but at the same time, unless you're going to bury your head in the sand, you should also acknowledge the fact that from various historical moments, time to time, the role of force has been a central element of progress.
We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the seed.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Subversive History. I am super excited to finally get to interview Dr. Gerald Horne, activist, professor, prolific writer, and arguably the most important historian of our time, the holder of the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, alumni of prestigious Princeton University of New Jersey and UC Berkeley alumni, an indispensable wealth of information for anyone that hopes to even begin to understand the foundations of American history and the greatest modern purveyor of violence and the many collective movements of resistance to said violence. The work of Dr. Horne cannot be overlooked or praised enough. And I'm going to hand things over to Pat.
Right. I have a little bit of an introduction that I wanted to do as well. Gerald Horne has penned an impressive catalog of historical works, including the Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century, and his newest book, which we will be discussing in detail today, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. So this channel is titled Subversive History, and I was actually inspired to name this channel Subversive History after reading the notes of the fascistic dictator Jorge Ubico, who ruled Guatemala in the 1930s, who regularly branded those who advocated for labor rights and racial solidarity as subversives. This terminology is not exclusive to Ubico and replicates itself almost ubiquitously throughout the modern history of radical movements, and this is especially true of the book we are focusing on today. Whether his work is concerning Black radicals in the United States, slave revolts, the plight of indigenous populations, or the counter-revolutionary nature of the American empire, there may not be a better representative author for the ethos of subversive history than Gerald Horne, whose work consistently highlights the struggles of those who would have been branded as subversives, whether it be by sordid characters such as Ubico in Guatemala or J. Edgar Hoover in the United States of America. So, Professor Horne, I just want to thank you so much for taking some time to sit down with us today and discuss this book.
Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So just to get into the first questions here, Professor Horne, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I counted 37 books in your repertoire that you've published.
That's in the ballpark.
Many of these books contain a departure from the orthodox narratives of history. Can you provide an insight into what motivated you to dedicate yourself so earnestly to the pursuit of history from this revisionist angle? And when I say revisionist, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in the necessary revisionism of history that, combats certain kind of like imperialist narratives.
Well, I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, when it was under the pall of Jim Crow. My parents had roots in Jim Crow, Mississippi, the heart of darkness, as far as violence and racism and lynching were concerned. So I grew up being weaned on stories of the horrors of Mississippi, actually making me afraid to visit relatives there, which I've hardly done because I still carry a bit of apprehension and nervousness, even though Mississippi has changed quite a bit since the time that I was a youth. And so on the one hand, I was being told these stories by my parents about how they had to get off the sidewalk when a Euro-American was approaching them and walk in the gutter, how you could not look them in the eye when they were talking to you. You had to look down and look away, et cetera. I mean, all of these horrible stories about U.S. apartheid. At the same time, in schools, oftentimes I was being fed a different story. And like many, I tended to believe my parents over others. And so I think that drilled into me the desire to explore on a deeper and more profound level the history of the United States of America. And one does not have to be a genius or an oracle to suspect there's something awry.
Yeah.
Because after all, even if you have not explored history, you know that the current configuration of the United States of America only goes back a few centuries. And then you need to ask yourself, well, what was happening before these European settlers arrived on this territory? What was happening before they began the systematic liquidation of the indigenous population, and why did they do that? And what was happening and why they would choose to manacle Africans and drag them kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free, and how that combustibility led inevitably to eruptions, to struggles, to revolts, et cetera, which, as your introduction suggested, has been the sum and substance of a lot of my work.
Amazing. So, now that we're kind of, spending a moment talking about your personal development, this does give us a, nice segue to talk about your newest book release, because you actually describe a little bit of your own personal involvement working alongside the Black Panther Party. And I know you mentioned you also had correspondences with Erica Huggins. I believe you were referred to as Jerry Horne without an E on the end of it.
Yeah. So I may not be as young as I look. So I arrived in Berkeley, California for the first time in the summer of 1969, believe it or not. And it was for a conference, one of the high points of the history of the Black Panther Party, a conference on anti-fascism that was taking place in Berkeley, Oakland. And that trip also was a way for me to inspect what was to become my home, beginning in 1970 for the next 3 years as I was a law student at the University of California at Berkeley. And during that time, I worked alongside the Black Panther Party. As you know from perusing the book, the iteration of the Panthers that I talk about, because there were different iterations, comes into existence in Berkeley, Oakland, circa 1966. And I worked alongside them. I taught at Vacaville Prison, just north of Berkeley, which I think is still in existence. It was sort of a place, a second residence, I'm afraid to say, for many political dissidents, particularly Panthers. I talk in the introduction about lending my prized copy
of Frederick Engels' Family. It was on Family by Frederick Engels that you led to a prisoner there, right?
The Origins of Family, Private Property, and State, which I highly recommend. It's really a seminal and ovular work when it comes to understanding capitalism. But in any case, I lent it to the prisoner who was then called Donald DeFries. Then he goes up in flames a few years later after being freed. He's affiliated with the, quote, Symbionese Liberation Army.
Right.
They have a shootout in Los Angeles with the police. And of course, the cautionary tale is be careful about who you lend books to, because I never got my book back. But in any case, as I say in the introduction, this story that I tell about Panthers, Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals, I know a lot of the principles. I knew a lot of the principles that I write about. I was at the celebration party for the then youthful Angela Davis after she was acquitted in 1972 on charges that could have brought the death penalty. I knew her lawyer, Howard Moore. I knew his spouse, who was a classmate of mine in law school. So this book is not just a product of research, which obviously it is, but it is imbued with my personal recollections of that time. And I would like to think that that gives this book an added character, but we'll leave it to the critics to decide.
Absolutely. So, as we have mentioned before, your newest book is titled Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California throughout the 60s and 70s. Now, if I were asked to describe this book in one word, it would simply be authoritative. That would be the one word that comes to mind after I've read it. The whole book is filled with copious footnotes and citations, and the general content of the work is dense with names, dates, and quotations. While this book breaks new grounds in terms of comprehensive detail, the interrogation of armed struggle as a philosophy has an established literary history. Domenico Lacerdo's Nonviolence, A History Beyond the Myth. This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed by Charles E. Cobb. The works of Robert F. Williams all come to mind. How would you say your book figures into this tradition, which examines the merit of armed struggle versus nonviolent resistance?
Well, first of all, I draw a distinction in these pages, as the chapter title suggests, between and amongst armed propaganda, armed self-defense, and armed struggle. Armed propaganda, when the Panthers marched into the Sacramento legislature in May 1967, armed in protests of pending legislation. That was an example of armed propaganda. The African National Congress during the anti-apartheid era, the apartheid era, engaged in armed propaganda bombings where they knew that there would be no civilian bloodshed, but that a message would be sent. And then there's armed self-defense. An example of that, December 1969, when the LAPD attacks the Panther headquarters in Los Angeles. And of course, they shoot back, they fight back. They did not want to be sitting ducks.
Right.
And then there's armed struggle, as exemplified in August 1970, when the precocious teenager Jonathan Jackson, roots in Pasadena, leads an assault on the Marin County Courthouse. It appears that a purpose was to free his older brother, George Jackson, who becomes a well-known and celebrated political prisoner before he too is killed in August 1971, a scant year later after Jonathan Jackson and two of his comrades are killed along with the judge during the Marin County action.
Which actually, we're on the 3 days ago was the 50-year anniversary of that incident, correct?
Yeah. Correct.
54 years, yeah.
Those incidents lead to the marking of what's called Black August, which is particularly marked in the state of California, albeit elsewhere as well. It's sort of a militant Black History Month, if you like. And what I'm trying to do in this book, I'm trying to do a number of things. I mean, first of all, the book is in at least implicit conversation with some of those works that you've mentioned. I mentioned early on that there was a kind of apprehension about the exclusive focus on philosophical and practical nonviolence for various reasons. Not least because that only tells part of the story. I mean, I begin this book in Algeria in 1971, when Panthers are consulting with diplomats from then socialist Czechoslovakia about getting arms to bring back to North America for the struggle. So to leave that story untold means that you're leaving a larger story untold. And then this book, in some ways, like the old-fashioned Russian dolls, where you take off one doll and leads to another doll. The Russian dolls involved in this story are some of my earlier works. I mean, for example, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ask the fundamental question, which is, why was it that these Black people felt that it was useful and necessary to launch armed struggle? And there hangs a tale, because you may know that in my 16th century book, which came out a few years ago, I pointed out that when London first sent settlers across the Atlantic to what they called North Carolina in the 1580s, that this was a class collaboration. That is to say, the settlers were sponsored by the 1% in London, but it was a multi-class collaboration in terms of invading what they call North Carolina, eventually plundering the indigenous, eventually enslaving the Africans. And class collaboration has been a central, although oftentimes unacknowledged theme in the history of settler colonialism. Interestingly enough, since the heroic student uprisings on college campuses focusing on settler colonialism and historic Palestine,
Yep.
That descriptor has barged its way into the vocabulary of many in the United States, because obviously this country is the heavyweight champion of settler colonialism. And I don't think you can understand settler colonialism and the history of the United States and all of the crimes with which it has been associated unless you understand class collaboration, for example.
Right.
Which helps to, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to move on to the next question. I thought you were wrapping up. Please finish your thought.
Okay. And so there's class collaboration on the one hand, and then, of course, you have class struggle, which obviously has been an essential component of the history of the United States, as some of my work suggests. I wrote a book called Class Struggle in Hollywood, for example, which deals with the struggle of labor in Hollywood in the 20th century. But also with regard to the United States, and particularly the early United States and colonial North America, the enslaved were forced into class struggle. There's nothing that generates class struggle more than being forced to work for free.
Right.
And being beaten and tortured in order to get you to do so. And of course, the epitome of that is the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, where the enslaved rebel against labor exploitation and white supremacy and racism and kick out the exploiters, a real turning point in the history of the world, a turning point in terms of the history of the United States. And so part of understanding the United States as we speak is understanding this dance between class collaboration on the one hand and class struggle on the other. Many of our friends on the left, perhaps understandably, perhaps they want to keep up the optimism. They focus heavily on class struggle, but that would be as if a Christian pastor or religious cleric was focusing only on heaven and not talking about hell.
Right.
And I think you need a discussion of both.
Amazing. And actually, I don't know if you noticed while you were giving your answer, maybe in like the midway point, both Johnny and I started laughing a little bit, and it's because you kind of almost predicted, or well, I'm sure not necessarily predicted, but the question that you asked is something that you actually pose in the first chapter of your book, which the first chapter of your book details the landscape in America from 1850 to 1935, a time period which includes the American Civil War, the abolition of chattel slavery, and the period known as Reconstruction. The first line of this chapter poses a question to the reader. Why was it that some Black folk found it necessary to pick up the gun a century after emancipation? So can you just summarize to our viewers the elements of this time period which were conducive to the political radicalization of Black Americans? Well,
first of all, there's the culture that's created after the U.S. takeover of the Golden State in the middle of the 19th century. Benjamin Matley, a historian at UCLA, has written a book on what he calls the genocide of the indigenous, and where he argues that although there is significant competition, there was no genocide more far-reaching and destructive than the genocide in California. Now, as a person who's written about Texas, in 19th century Texas, I find that not easy to accept. But when one looks at the culture that's created in the Golden State, not least the police violence, the officers of the law, so-called, who inflict violence, particularly upon Black people, particularly not only in terms of police killings and police terror, which is something we become all too familiar with this week. Speaking of anniversaries, we are marking the 10th anniversary of the killing of Black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, the suburb of St. Louis, which is just one example amongst many police killings. And of course, I would argue that these police killings of Black people, like the disproportionate imprisonment of Black people, it flows inevitably from the anti-Blackness that accompanies slavery. It flows inevitably, and I mentioned this at various points, from the fact that when enslavement was abolished in 1865, the slaveholders were expropriated without compensation, infuriating many of them as they were driven into poverty, leading to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and various kinds of terrorist formations, whose culture is then bequeathed to the police departments, who then continue to exact a reign of terror upon Black people in particular, causing them to cut to the chase, to eventually decide to take up arms as the situation is changing somewhat in the middle of the 1960s. But it's not just police terror. I mentioned in this book, and I'll mention it here, that we really need a study of arson in U.S. political culture. I do these interviews for KPFK, Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles. I interviewed a scholar a few weeks ago. You can find it online. Who talked about the slaves' use of arson, including trying to burn down the White House of the Confederate States of America, including trying to immolate the widow of George Washington in her bed for various reasons. But in the story that I tell, arson is being used against Black people, chase them out of certain neighborhoods. I mean, this is a sort of a roughhouse tactic to execute gentrification.
Right.
Just basically, people go to work and they come home and their home is
burned, no longer there.
It's no longer there. And so
the newspapers would describe it as a race riot.
Yeah, at best. And so
at best.
This is in part a response to your question.
Yep.
I think it's in the introduction about when Black people were migrating to California in the 1940s. Oftentimes they would take buses, and then how on a long distance bus ride, you were allowed to get off, perhaps then smoke a cigarette, use the bathroom. And then the bus driver would drive off and leave them in the middle of nowhere. Some of them didn't have money to get a hotel room. I mean, this is the sort of routine tactics of persecution that's administered against the Black population, which once again goes back to the anti-Blackness of enslavement, expropriation of private property without compensation, the dialectic between folks involved in class struggle versus class collaboration, the fact that the persecuted then oftentimes find it necessary to ally with the real and imagined enemies of the settlers, including the indigenous, including foreign powers, et cetera, which then in turn leads to a degree to advance on the part of the persecuted. But on the other hand, it increases the fury of those who are doing the persecution. So this is part of the wider framework that I'm sketching in this book.
Amazing. Thank you. So W.E.B. Du Bois is perhaps the most important figure in the Black radical tradition in the United States of America, and he inserts himself in this time period, which we're currently discussing. You have authored and co-authored multiple books on Du Bois, including what I believe is your first published book. Can you explain to our viewers the importance of Du Bois as a figure and how he blazed the trail in some respect for the Panthers decades later?
So William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, passes away in Ghana, West Africa in 1963. First Black person to get a doctorate from Harvard in the 1890s, matriculates in the University of Berlin, a founder of the NAACP, still with us in 1909, editor of their journal up until the mid-1930s when he's forced out, author of a number of important books, but particularly Black Reconstruction, which retells the story of that period following the U.S. Civil War, 1865, let us say, to 1877, when it's officially overthrown. And also going back to the NAACP in the 1940s during World War II as sort of a minister of foreign relations, trying to knock together a global anti-Jim Crow coalition under the guise of Pan-Africanism, a philosophy and practice that he pioneered in devising, an early victim of the Red Scare and Cold War, because as I talk about in this book, this book deals quite a bit with the NAACP and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the largest and oldest civil rights organization still with us. And when Du Bois is purged from their ranks, after returning to their ranks in 1944, purged in 1948. It's a real turning point in terms of the launching of the Red Scare, the launching of the Cold War. Radicals like Du Bois and his comrade Paul Robeson, who have also written about actor, singer, Pan-Africanist, socialists, et cetera, they're deep-sixed. And that's part of a Faustian bargain whereby anti-Jim Crow concessions are allotted to the Black community so that U.S. imperialism can improve its image in the international community in the face of national liberation movements in Africa and the Caribbean, then being assisted by the socialist camp. But the price of the ticket, of course, was the tossing overboard of the internationalists, which then makes it difficult for the Black community to forge the sort of global alliances that have been our saving grace. And of course, that problem is still with us today in 2024. And so Du Bois ultimately is driven into exile. Ghana, West Africa, 1961, joins the U.S. Communist Party before departing and dying in August 1963 is the March on Washington, where Dr. King makes his I Have a Dream speech is being enunciated, marking a new stage in the anti-Jim Crow movement. And so Du Bois, as an activist and an intellectual and a thinker, has been a kind of gold standard ever since. I would say for Black intellectuals in particular, but I would say for U.S. intellectuals in general.
Absolutely. So, and you might have noticed me and my co-host here laughing again as you brought up Paul Robeson, because now I will move on to my next question. So while we're on the topic of iconic figures of Black radicalism that you have written books on, I would also like to mention Paul Robeson. You mentioned Robeson multiple times in your book, specifically as an influence on the Panthers. I personally find Paul Robeson to be one of the most inspiring human beings to have ever lived. I actually have one of his records up on my shelf right there. You know, his rise from being the son of a slave to a star athlete, dazzling academic, and then being one of the most renowned theater performers and singers in history. When you consider this astounding resume, Robeson is conspicuously absent from many mainstream accounts of civil rights history or American history more broadly, considering he was one of the most famous Americans to ever live and was considered one of the most famous people in the entire world at one point. Can you offer an explanation as to why Robeson is not memorialized in mainstream American histories the way he obviously should be for his accomplishments?
Is it because he's from New Jersey?
Not really. It has more to do with the fact that he was for socialism.
Yeah.
And as you know, if you follow the politics of the United States, that is a forbidden philosophy to a certain degree. If you want to seek to isolate mainstream politicians today, you call them a socialist or perhaps a communist. And as I've suggested elsewhere, I think it ties back once again to the actions post-1865 when you had one of the largest uncompensated appropriations of private property in the history of the world to that point, when the investment in enslaved Africans was expropriated without compensation. And that expropriating property without compensation comes to be associated with socialism. Because let's face it, oftentimes that does happen when socialists come to power. I mean, look at Cuba, for example.
Right. Yeah.
There's still a grieving, not to mention an environment leading to, quote, terrorism, unquote, in South Florida because of the fact that post-January 1959, you had many affluent Cubans who were expropriated without compensation. As a matter of fact, I take it from your humor that you all are cited in New Jersey.
Yes.
How could you tell?
You're still Senator Robert Menendez, who has roots in Cuba. He says the reason that he kept gold bars in his closet.
Oh, that guy was Cuban?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
It's because when his parents fled Cuba, many of their properties were expropriated. And he wanted to make so that leads him to keep gold bars. Now,
first, he should have kept them in the bird feed, not in the jackets in the closet. This is a rookie mistake. Anybody? I'm sorry.
You're giving out tips to future felons.
Yeah, there you go. That's the real subversive history.
Right. So I think that undergirds the fact that Robeson, there's been an attempt to marginalize him, but I don't really think that that's sustainable in the long run. His intellectual and political and cultural counterpower is just too powerful to obscure indefinitely. And I look forward to the day when he is accorded the proper respect.
Right. And I agree with you that his legacy burns so bright that you can't really, sweep it under the rug. But the reason I bring that up is because I personally, you know what I mean? You can take my, socioeconomic status and everything like that. I didn't even know who Paul Robeson was until I started actually playing in the sandbox of like socialism and like studying things like that. Like it took me like going through a political transformation to even discover who Paul Robeson was. Like when I think like if I can learn who people like George Washington Carver were in like elementary school, I think Paul Robeson probably deserves a mention as well, is kind of why I brought up that conspicuous absence from like the historical record in many respects.
And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is connect the Panthers in particular to the socialist and communist tradition.
Yeah.
I would say that today, the historiography, that is to say, the works of history that are being produced, they place the Panthers in the Black Power tradition, which is not inaccurate, but they're part of another tradition, which is the socialist and communist tradition. Huey P. Newton, the founder, of course, admired by his own admission, Robeson, Fidel Castro, et cetera. A ditto for another leader who I talk about quite a bit in this book, Eldridge Cleaver.
I have a question about that coming up. I have a couple things I want to ask you about Eldridge Cleaver coming up, but yeah.
And I should also say this is consistent with the historiography, given the looming presence of Malcolm X, because the Black Power historiography oftentimes connects that historical and political turn to Islam, as exemplified by Malcolm X and his association with the Nation of Islam. And I carry that tradition forward, talking about how many of the prisoners that are attracted to the Black Panther Party oftentimes came in through the door of Islam. That is to say, that one of the history is argument without end. I don't see this book as the final word on any of the topics it addresses, not least because our needs as political people evolve. New records are always being released, which can add to the story, perhaps detract from the story. And in looking back on this book, I can see that one of the things I could have stressed that I didn't stress, that another historian can take up, is that on the East Coast, particularly in New York City, a lot of the Panthers are coming out of that Muslim tradition. Perhaps it's because of the influence of Malcolm X out of New York. Whereas in California, they were more coming out of the socialist and communist tradition, perhaps exemplified by all the time I spend talking about the strength of the Communist Party in the Southland, in Southern California in particular, and in Northern California, in Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco in particular.
Great. So now just to kind of get back into kind of like some of like the chronological discussion of your book, the term Red Scare is commonly associated with the specter of McCarthyism. However, this ignores the first Red Scare following World War I and the Russian Revolution of 1917. This initial Red Scare had a specific emphasis on Black Americans and alleged allegiance to Bolshevism or otherwise subversive activity. This led to an era known as Red Summer, in which anti-Black pogroms were conducted throughout the nation. Could you provide a summary of this event and how it influenced Black Americans to consider armed struggle as a valid course of action?
Well, speaking of those pogroms, you need look no further than what transpired in my neck of the woods across the Mississippi from St. Louis. Speaking of East St. Louis, one of the bloodiest pogroms took place. But it was not just East St. Louis, it was Chicago. Part of it was a reaction to Black American soldiers returning from the battlefields of World War I. They had been told that this was a struggle. World War I was a struggle to enforce democracy. And yet they were coming back to third-class citizenship. That creates combustibility. They seek to vindicate their rights, but their opponents strive mightily to ensure that that does not take place. And that, of course, leads to the shedding of blood. But it also has something to do with the fact that because of persecution, you've had a significant number of Black Americans who've been attracted to radicalism. For example, one of the characters in the book on the table is Cyril Briggs, who winds up in Los Angeles. He's part of the Communist Party, but before he's in the Communist Party, he's part of a group called the African Blood Brotherhood, which is a kind of secretive paramilitary organization from the World War I era.
Oh, okay.
We need more study and investigation of the African Blood Brotherhood. And as well, his roots were in the Caribbean, as could be said about Malcolm X, whose roots were in Grenada, the tiny Caribbean island. These Caribbean migrants have added a special militancy to Black American struggles, not least perhaps because the Caribbean features these overwhelmingly Black islands where that leads ultimately to independence under Black leadership. And then oftentimes the Black leadership is not carrying forth in a manner that the radicals see as progressive, which then leads to class struggle, Black versus Black, which then is something that's different oftentimes from the struggles that take place here in North America. And so from the inception of the U.S. Communist Party, circa 1918, 1919, you have Black membership, which is something new in terms of political parties, for example, because even though the Republican Party styled itself as the party of Black nationals, Black citizens, of course, they were a Jim Crow party, and of course, the Democratic Party at that time, this is before the rise of the New Deal in the 1930s, they had an armed wing called the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
And so the rise of the left, which tries to shift the discourse from race to class.
Yeah.
Recall, to go back to this Russian doll analogy, my books earliest in chronology deal with the 15th century and the 16th century, at which point religion was a major flashpoint of society. Muslims versus Christians, Protestants versus Catholics, Christians versus Jewish, etc. And then with the advent of London colonialism, aforementioned beginning in North Carolina, what they call North Carolina in the 1580s, you have a shift from religion to race, which then allows the settlers to expand the base of settlerdom by inviting into the halls of exploitation those who were Jewish.
Right.
We have the construction of whiteness.
Yes.
White supremacy. etc. And then with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a staggering blow is inflicted against white supremacy. And that's followed by the rise of a class-based project, because you see the rising of unions in particular in the United States, the struggle for the 8-hour day and unions in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, and then reaching the efflorescence with the socialist revolutions of the 20th century, of which the Communist Party pays fealty to. And so they try to shift the discourse from class, so it's from religion to class. And of course, as noted, this shift to class has not been greeted with equanimity by all. And even to this very day, it's seen as problematic by some.
Right. So the next thing I'd like to bring up is the Scottsboro trials. The Scottsboro trials were not only a massive chapter in the story of racial discrimination in the United States of America, but also represents a watershed moment for Black Americans' association with the Communist Party. Can you summarize the Scottsboro trials briefly for the audience, and then also how that influenced Black Americans' perspective of the Communist Party?
Sure. And by the way, I have a young adult book on the Scottsboro trial.
Oh, really?
Interested.
No, I had no idea.
Scottsboro on the title. So March 1931, 9 Black youth are hoboing, riding the rails, looking for jobs in southern Tennessee, northern Alabama. They encounter 2 Euro-American women who then charge them with sexual molestation falsely. They're being railroaded on the way to execution, like so many before and since. But riding to the rescue is the International Labor Defense, which is detractors with subsequently termed a so-called Communist Front, that is to say the U.S. Communist Party and their comrades internationally had a role in forming. A part of the story that I tell is that at one point you had a Communist International, that is to say a rainbow organization, an umbrella organization of communist parties, headquartered in Moscow. And as I talk about in the introduction to the book at hand, in addition to political education, they're teaching the rudiments of armed struggle, for example, which obviously does not win them plaudits in Washington and London. In any case, the International Labor Defense launches a worldwide campaign on behalf of the Scottsboro Nine. Robeson's comrade, who influences Robeson deeply, speaking of William L. Patterson, another Black lawyer with roots in the San Francisco Bay Area, who goes on to become a counselor to the Panthers and a leader of the defense of then political prisoner Angela Davis. William L. Patterson is the leader of this struggle. By the way, he's in and out of Nazi Germany on various missions in the 1930s, anti-fascist missions. I have a book about Patterson that you can consult.
Yeah, that's
so. In any case, this Scottsboro case is a turning point in the struggle against Jim Crow because it internationalizes the struggle, which has been, as noted, the strength of our movement and the strength of the anti-racist movement in particular. It leads directly to Supreme Court cases that then change the law of criminal procedure. Defendants still are enjoying some of these protections as we speak. And it's a prelude to the anti-Jim Crow opinions of the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1950s, which then delivers us to the era in which we're engaged in today in 2024.
Right. And, the next question I have concerns the Smith Act trials, which I feel is kind of the next, pivotal moment in this discussion. You have two chapters of your book that are dedicated to the Smith trials of the 1950s, which were somewhat emblematic of the second and more well-known Red Scare. In your words, this period amounted to more than just an assault on the Communist Party, but something that shaped the entire political climate inescapably, is how you described it. Can you summarize this, and describe the Smith Act trials and their political significance for our audience?
So there were scores of trials beginning in 1949 against the Communist Party, ostensibly, but actually against radical thinking.
Yes.
These were trials that were seeking to illegalize socialist thinking, illegalize socialist praxis. The ostensible reason for these trials was that supposedly, as the formula was suggested at that time, ML equals FV. Marxist-Leninism equals force and violence. And so therefore, the US authorities put on trial from the Atlantic all the way out to the Pacific. There were Smith Act trials in Honolulu that I talked about in my book on 20th century Hawaii, for example. And it basically decapitated the Communist Party. But it not only decapitated the Communist Party, it constricted radical thinking generally, because even if you weren't going to join the Communist Party, you had to look over your shoulder perpetually if you were in favor of socialism, for example. And so it narrows possibilities. And this is a prelude, of course, to the agonizing and halting retreat from Jim Crow, whereby Black people were allotted the right to check into a hotel, but because of the attack on left-wing unions, they did not necessarily have the income to pay the bill, because a complement, so to speak, to the Smith Act trials were an attack on unions.
Right.
Taft-Hartley legislation of 1947, for example. And one of the reasons why unions are in such a bad way, even today, is the legacy of the Red Scare. I mean, if you're a union leader whose ostensible job is to uplift the working class, it's difficult for you to speak about it in those terms, because uplifting the working class seems to carry the flavor of socialism.
Yeah, you're a crypto Bolshevism.
Exactly. And so you have to be very careful as a union leader even today in 2024. And so,
especially in places like Colombia and things like that. Yeah,
exactly. So, California, Southern California was a particular target because that was one of the citadels of the Communist Party. They were running candidates for office who were getting thousands, tens of thousands of votes, believe it or not, before the Smith Act trials. And then, of course, after the trials ended in the 1960s, they resumed getting thousands and tens of thousands of votes. And so this was also a political struggle. It was an attempt to hogtie political opponents to the left, which I'm afraid to say is still part of the political conversation in the United States.
Absolutely. So as we progress through this time period here, now we'll move on to the more well-known, or should I say more publicized era of civil rights in the United States, of which Martin Luther King Jr. has been elevated to the level of like a deity in the mind of mainstream America. However, MLK has remained a somewhat controversial figure, with many who uphold his legacy ignoring his more radical development and critiques of capitalism, while others, including the Black Panther George Jackson, refer to him as a bootlicker. Can you provide our listeners with a contextualized and nuanced depiction of Martin Luther King Jr. as a person and a political figure?
Well, I think Dr. King was deeply influenced by the left. One of his advisors was Jack Odell, who only passed away a few years ago at the age of 96 in exile in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Right.
And Jack had Communist Party roots. He becomes an advisor to Dr. King, shaping his philosophy, particularly his relationship with unions, because Jack had a trade union background. Kennedy brings King into the Rose Garden to escape possible bugging of the Oval Office, to tell him to get rid of Jack Odell, and King does not, even though he says he will. Right. And then that leads to charges that he's a notorious liar, as the leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, put it.
Yep.
A few weeks before King was assassinated in April 1968, he speaks at a fundraiser for Freedom Ways magazine. In full disclosure, I used to write for Freedom Ways magazine.
Nice.
It was a creation of Jack and other former and actual communists, some left-leaning pole in the anti-Jim Crow movement. And that fundraiser, Dr. King spoke glowingly about Du Bois and Du Bois's socialism, Du Bois being a communist. A few weeks later, he was killed, of course.
He spoke glowingly of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana as well.
Course.
Right.
Yeah. He was there. He was at the inauguration, I believe, in Ghana. Yeah. So, yeah.
And so I think George Jackson was reacting to what many consider to be an overdetermination of nonviolence and an underappreciation of the role of force in terms of bringing progress and bringing gains. In any case, I think that Dr. King deserves the merit and the appreciation, the applause that he continues to receive, because as his assassination suggests, he was on a very dangerous mission in a country like this.
No, and I 100% agree. And, if you're familiar, there's a book by Peniel Joseph called The Sword and the Shield. And that book has been like a guiding light in like my understanding of like the civil rights era and things like that. Like, I cannot recommend that book enough. And actually, I'm going to quote that book right here as I ask you another question. So while we are discussing Martin Luther King, can you speak on the foundation of violence, or at least the threat of violence, that undergirded and largely enabled Martin Luther King's strategy of nonviolence? Typically, this Gandhian tactic is retrospectively embraced as the primary force in obtaining civil rights. However, many would say that these achievements for civil rights would never have been possible without the at least threat of violent resistance that not only served as its grim alternative, but also its protector. For example, in your book, you state that even the philosophically nonviolent Dr. King applied for a gun permit to carry a concealed firearm, and armed supporters took turns guarding King's home. This home, said advisor Glenn Smiley, contained an arsenal, referring to an arsenal of weaponry. And that's kind of what I'm talking about in protection. But in terms of the grim alternative, there's also a telegram that Malcolm X sends to Martin Luther King while he's in St. Augustine, where he says, just say the word and we will immediately dispatch some of our brothers there to organize self-defense unity among our people. And the Ku Klux Klan will then receive a taste of its own medicine. So you even have Malcolm X kind of in the background being like, hey, while you're doing the nonviolent stuff down there in St. Augustine, you call us if you want to give the KKK a taste of their own
Let us
medicine.
know when you're ready.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of Dr. King's dealings with either whether it's President Kennedy or President Johnson was kind of backdoor deals where King kind of referred to himself as a fireman. Like, I have to go out and put out these fires, and like kind of it's like I'm the only one that's standing in the way of what is full-on violent uprising. So it's like, can you just talk about like that kind of undergirding of the threat of violence and the protection of Dr. King, those who lead this nonviolent campaign?
So James Foreman, who becomes a leader of the Panthers and is also a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the shock troops of the movement, he once suggested that it was violence that helped to uproot the indigenous, and that inevitably that violence would be used to correct that kind of injustice. Charlie Cobb, who was also a leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I'm getting my interviews confused, but perhaps you or perhaps somebody else I was talking to mentioned his book that's nonviolent stuff.
I mentioned it in the beginning.
Yeah. So there was always a kind of, shall we say, ambivalence,
yes,
amongst many about what was considered to be an overdetermination of nonviolence. And then in turn, that leads to the rise of the Black Panther Party, because as I point out, once they accelerate their militancy, you begin to see enhanced donations to the NAACP, for example, which of course disdained that option of force.
Right.
And I should also mention that historians of slavery are beginning to examine the unavoidable fact that with regard to the overthrow of that institution, it was not only the 200,000 Black men enlisted in the Union Army in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation who helped to overthrow slavery by force of arms, but of course, October 1859, John Brown, the man of European ancestry, perhaps most admired by Black Americans, the subject of a biography by Du Bois, leads an armed uprising against enslavement. Nat Turner, 1831, Southampton, Virginia. So I think that we're restriking the balance.
Yeah.
That is to say, we acknowledge the importance of the strategy and tactics of nonviolence, but at the same time, unless you're going to bury your head in the sand, you should also acknowledge the fact that from various historical moments, time to time, the role of force has been a central element of progress.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, so now to actually, you've brought up the Black Panther Party several times here. They really don't need much of an introduction. But as we discuss the evolution of the Black Panther Party, a name which is inescapable is Eldridge Cleaver. While he is undeniably formative in the development of the Black Panther Party, he's also irredeemably problematic and, in my opinion, an overall disgrace to the legacy of the party. Can you describe the controversial legacy of Eldridge Cleaver to the audience?
Well, let's start with the negative. And acknowledge rapists.
Yep.
And acknowledge spouse batterer.
Yes.
Homophobic.
Yep.
Insanely jealous, reputedly slaying a paramour of his spouse after he had, of course, had numerous extramarital affairs himself.
Right.
But at the same time, Eldridge Cleaver, a bundle of contradictions, helped to establish the international legation of the Black Panther Party in Algiers, North Africa, which was a real breakthrough in terms of the Black Liberation Movement, inspiring fraternal delegations to the country then known as the People's Republic of the Congo and Brazzaville across the Congo River from the larger Congo. and of course, going on solidarity missions to China, North Korea, Vietnam, counseling Black soldiers to turn their guns around during the war in Vietnam and attack their officers more so than the Vietnamese.
Right.
A man who inspires a Panther underground. Once again, I see my book as just the beginning of telling the story about the Panther underground. We need more exploration of that topic.
Yeah.
So Cleaver's a bundle of contradictions, and I focus on him quite a bit because
he's mentioned a lot in the book. Yeah,
you know, his roots are in Southern California. My book has Southern California in the title.
Right.
He, after Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, was probably the leading figure in the party. So it's understandable why I focus on him.
Oh, I agree.
He's a bundle of contradictions.
Can you, and I know this might be a little bit trivial, but
did you buy a cod piece?
Can you explain the pants advertisement that he did later in his life, which was fully unaware of until I read your book, and I found it a little bit humorous, and I thought maybe we could make a little reprieve here into something a little bit more humorous.
So Cleaver, after he had painted himself into a corner by burning bridges, you know, he attacked the Cubans, he attacked the Algerians, et cetera. And so finally, in a certain way, he was left with few choices. So he decides to become a designer of sexy men's pants with a cod piece. Yeah. Cod piece, you may recall, accentuates the genitals
yes,
of a man. And he appears in the ads with his sexy men's pants, for example. And that's just the beginning of a downward slide into conservative Christianity, into Mormonism, believe it.
Wow.
Even flirting with like Zionism, even like earlier flirting with Zionism as well.
He was really taken with Zionism.
Didn't the same thing happen with Huey too? Like, didn't he?
Well, no, he was Huey. There's pictures of Huey in Palestine with the PLO.
Okay. No, not Zionism. I mean like Mormonism or something. I feel like there was another founding member that. Sorry for the
necessarily Huey P. Newton, although that's another story.
Yeah.
That I don't focus on because others have.
Right.
Which has a lot to do with this uplifting of the lumpen, without drawing meaningful distinctions between the lumpen proletariat on the one hand and the industrial reserve army, the unemployed on the other hand. Drawing a distinction between the big lumpen, organized crime families, and the little lumpen, small-time drug dealers, for example. And so Huey Newton, as you know, is killed in 1989. Apparently in the midst of a drug deal. Which, and in many ways bespeaks the lumpen trajectory in which the Panthers found themselves.
So kind of going back to this thing, and you touched on this a little bit with Cleaver, and you mentioned this in the book many times, and I would just like to ask you, so something that's mentioned numerous times in the book is the ideological commitment of the Black Panther Party to, quote, colored, unquote, China, as opposed to the, quote, white, unquote, Soviets that allegedly colluded with Washington. Can you describe the ideological consequence of the Sino-Soviet split and its detrimental effect it had on the Black Panther Party?
So about 50 years ago, approximately, Nixon and Kissinger, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, embarked on a journey to China. You had the Chinese Revolution circa 1949. But for various reasons that I allude to in the book, a rift develops between China, not only in China and the Soviet Union, but China and many communist parties. This has detrimental impact upon our movement worldwide. I talk about this, for example, in my book on Southern Africa, where I talk about its detrimental impact in Angola during the liberation movement in the 1970s. For various reasons, the Panthers come to the conclusion that it was not a case of Washington and Beijing or Peking colluding against Moscow. It was Moscow and Washington colluding against China. There wasn't that much evidence in that regard. As you know, I did a book on pro-Tokyo Black nationalism before 1945. It's called Facing the Rising Sun. Many of the Black nationalists were really attracted to Japan, which styled itself pre-1945, pre-Hiroshima Nagasaki atomic bombing, as a champion of the colored races. And I think that many of the Panthers thought in China you had a recrudescence of a pre-1945 Tokyo, which of course which influences the Nation of Islam, influences many black nationalists, even black nationalist ideology today with some of these rappers still invoking the Asiatic black man, although I'm not sure whether they know where it comes from.
Wu-Tang Clan will bring up that from time
really
to time.
Comes from the 1930s. And Tokyo black nationalism. Mm-hmm. And so in any case, what happens is that the country that would have been their most reliable ally, speaking of Cuba, was tied to the Soviet Union. And so when they began attacking the Cubans' patron, it in many ways, it burns a bridge to Cuba. And of course, many in the international movement found it curious that they would be pro-China. Now, interestingly enough, China, in many ways, got a good deal, because what happens is that leads to massive foreign direct investment into China from U.S. corporations. Yep. In the 1970s, when the Panthers are still in existence, you see that Leonard Woodcock, who was a leader of the United Auto Workers, becomes the U.S. ambassador to China and helps to shepherd the moving of manufacturing facilities across the Pacific to China, which has now created this juggernaut, leading to their leadership in lunar exploration, quantum computing, green energy, and all the rest. Now the United States is trying to round up a posse to go after China, which could be quite dangerous to international peace and security. So in any case, that's part of the backstory that I tell in this book. The Panthers' relationship to China, their relationship to the Sino-Soviet split.
Exactly.
How it has negative impact on their relations to Cuba.
So while the Black Panthers endorse an explicitly Marxist-Leninist platform, this did not translate to ideological symmetry with the American Communist Party. For example, you quote George Jackson as accusing the American Communist Party as potentially being counter-revolutionary and insecure. And in another section, David Hilliard is quoted as saying, "We dig communism, but we have criticisms of the American Communist Party." Can you describe the nature and cause of that disparity?
Well, part of it has to do with Moscow versus China.
Okay, yeah, which we just covered, yeah.
Part of it has to do, as I suggested at one point, that in a certain sense, if the Panthers were going to exist and be on all fours in accord with the Communist Party, well, then the question would rise, why don't you become like an affiliate of the Communist Party, like the Che Lumumba Club that Angela Davis was a part of, an all-black formation within the Communist Party. But there are also differences with regard to the working class versus the lumpen. I'm critical of the U.S. left today because of a failure to analyze settler colonialism and the class collaborationism that inheres in settler colonialism. I think that if the U.S. communists had been more on the ball with regard to that, it could have made for easier concord with the Communist Party. A Black communist leader, Roscoe Proctor, said that there was a basic mistrust amongst Black Americans of the overall U.S. working class movement. And of course, if you look at the fact that in 1991, David Duke, a neo-Nazi, receives 55% of the Euro-American vote across class lines, including a goodly number of Euro-American workers in this race for governor, you can understand why Roscoe Proctor would make that analysis. And as I think I said earlier, we need to understand the fundamental tension between class struggle, which inhered in slavery, and class collaboration, which inhered in settler colonialism.
Professor Horne, it's 4:14. Well, 4:14 here. It's about 3:14 where you are. There is 3 questions remaining. I'm not sure if you have time, and we can kind of go through them quickly, or if you'd like, I can give you one last one, and then we can wrap it up. Yeah,
just give me one last one, or I can always come back at another time.
Okay. All right. So I think that it's only most appropriate that I end with this question here. We have had a long and endearing conversation, which ultimately rests upon the topic of armed struggles and armed resistances. To discuss this topic in 2024 and to not mention Gaza would be criminal. In your book, you quote William Wells Brown as saying, any enslaved person who took up arms to gain their freedom would be viewed as innocent in the eyes of God. Recently, Norman Finkelstein has come under heavy criticism due to his comparison of the events of October 7th to historic examples of armed resistance, such as Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As someone who just wrote an authoritative text on the topic of armed struggle, can you offer your interpretation of the violent resistance from Gaza witnessed on October 7th and how it compares to these past events?
Well, I think I mentioned when I was talking about settler colonialism, the heroic student uprisings, which helped to reanimate the concept of settler colonialism as they applied it to Palestine. If I didn't mention it, let me mention it now, because obviously that discourse has ricocheted into North America. It's well known under international law that people under occupation have quite a bit of latitude and elasticity in terms of the strategy and tactics they pursue to end that occupation. I mean, look at France under Nazi occupation in the 1940s, for example. The French resistance being a model that in some ways the Palestinian resistance is emulating. I think what the Palestinian resistance needs from people in the United States is more pressure from us on the US government to curtail, if not cease altogether, their arming the piratical state in Israel, which in turn is inflicting violence on the Palestinians, which then causes them to fight back. It seems to me that's a very simple formulation. I would like to talk more, but believe it or not, I'm already late to another interview.
Okay, so just off that, I just want to say thank you so much. You know, we're quite a small channel, so like the fact that you took an hour of your time to come and have this conversation, we are eternally grateful for that. I don't want to take up any more of your time as you're already running late, and just want to once again say thank you. Is there a possibility in the future that if we were to get another one of your books and to read it, that we could maybe set up another interview to discuss another one of the books that you've read?
Of course.
Okay, amazing. So we'll cut you loose here. Thank you so much, and I apologize if I stressed your time a little bit, but I had a lot of things that I really enjoyed about this book, and I love discussing with you.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Don't treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. It's USSR, PLO style, PLO style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical and fight them. Capitalism and democracy, capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene.